What happened in Black Ridge Hollow in the winter of 1903 is one such abomination, a tale that powerful men have spent more than a century trying to expunge from history. But the truth refuses to remain silent. They destroyed the evidence. They silenced the witnesses. They rewrote the official account. But they couldn't erase everything. And now, you're about to learn what they never wanted you to know. The Appalachian Mountains hold their secrets close. These ancient hills, worn down by time yet still imposing in their quiet majesty, have witnessed countless atrocities since the first European settlers carved homesteads from the wilderness. Blood has seeped into this soil for centuries, from the original displacement of native tribes, through the brutal conflicts of the Civil War, to the forgotten feuds that never made it into history books. But what happened in the remote hollow, known locally as Black Ridge, transcends ordinary human cruelty. It breached the fundamental laws of nature itself. I first encountered the name William Jackson while researching disappeared communities in northern Alabama, those small settlements that vanished from maps between census periods, their inhabitants scattered without explanation. Black Ridge Hollow was one such place. In 1900, it housed 17 families clustered around a crossroads with a general store and a small Baptist church. By 1910, it had ceased to exist entirely. No record of natural disaster, no economic explanation. Simply gone, as if it had been surgically removed from the landscape and the collective memory of the region. The official explanation, the comfortable fiction recorded in county development records, claimed the inhabitants relocated voluntarily when the Northeastern Alabama Mining Consortium purchased the land for coal extraction. But no mining operations ever materialized. No survey stakes were driven. The road leading into the hollow was blocked with a gate bearing federal warning signs, though no government agency would claim responsibility for them when questioned. William Jackson was not the monster that newspaper accounts claimed. He was something far worse and far more significant. The official story, the comfortable fiction that appeared in the Birmingham Sentinel on February 17, 1903, described Jackson as a simple mountain hermit who murdered 7 people in a deranged killing spree before being shot by a heroic county sheriff. A tidy narrative, conveniently forgotten, but the official story was fabricated to hide a truth too terrible to acknowledge. I've spent 11 years investigating what really happened in those remote Appalachian hollows. I've gathered fragments from sealed courthouse basements, from private journals, from the desperate scribbles of asylum patients, from the coded letters of frightened physicians. Every thread of evidence leads to the same horrifying conclusion. William Jackson achieved something that defied natural law, and the power structure of an entire region conspired to conceal it. My investigation began with a simple discrepancy. In the newspaper account, William Jackson was described as an elderly recluse of unsound mind, approximately 70 years of age. Yet, when I cross-referenced property tax records from the period, the William Jackson, who owned the 340-acre parcel at Black Ridge Hollow, had been paying taxes on that land continuously since 1837, a span of 66 years. If he had been a young man of 20 when he acquired the property, he would have been closer to 86 at the time of the incident, not 70. A minor discrepancy, perhaps, but it was the loose thread that, once pulled, began to unravel the entire fabrication. Because it wasn't merely the newspaper that had Jackson's age wrong. Every official document related to the case contained inconsistencies that defied rational explanation. The more I dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. In the Winston County Sheriff's initial incident report, which was subsequently sealed by judicial order and removed from public archives, Jackson was described as a man of approximately 40 years with unusual physical vigor. In the coroner's report, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information request that took 3 years to process, Jackson's body was described as male, 30 to 35 years, with unusual tissue characteristics requiring specialized examination. And in a telegram sent from the county medical examiner to a private physician in Birmingham, which I discovered in the personal papers of Judge Carson's court clerk, Jackson was referred to as the ageless one, with no elaboration on what that cryptic phrase might mean. How could the same man be described as elderly, middle-aged, and youthful by different officials involved in the same case? What would compel respected public servants to file such wildly contradictory reports? The answer emerged as I discovered more pieces of this fractured historical puzzle. The first peculiarity I discovered was in the birth records. William Jackson appears in the 1850 census of Winston County, Alabama, listed as a 37-year-old farmer. He appears again in the 1870 census, still recorded as 37 years old. In the 1890 census, again 37. The census taker's error you might reasonably assume, but the same age discrepancy appears in land purchase records, in a marriage certificate from 1867, and hospital admission papers from 1895. For over 50 years, William Jackson's documented age never changed. This statistical anomaly becomes even more significant when you consider what else was happening in northern Alabama during this period. The region was undergoing profound transformation, from frontier territory to settled agricultural communities, through the upheaval of the Civil War into the early industrial era. Lives were typically short, harsh, and marked by physical deterioration. The average male life expectancy in Alabama during this period was approximately 47 years. Yet here was William Jackson, his age frozen on paper while decades of history flowed around him. Even more compelling evidence comes from the personal writings of those who encountered Jackson throughout these decades. The diary of Reverend Thaddeus Bowen, who served as circuit preacher in Winston County from 1855 to 1878, contains multiple references to Jackson. In an entry from April 1856, Bowen describes him as, quote, a sturdy fellow of middle years with a distinctive scar upon his jaw, who asked perceptive questions about Scripture but declined invitation to services. Nearly 20 years later, in December 1874, Bowen writes, called upon Mr. Jackson regarding charitable contribution for the widow Simmons, was struck again by his unchanged countenance. The same man I met when first arriving in the county, without a single new line upon his face or gray hair added to his head. Most unsettling to behold. Photographs tell an even more disturbing story. I've recovered 3 verified images of Jackson, a daguerreotype from 1853, a formal portrait from 1881, and a group photograph from 1901. In each image, despite the span of nearly half a century, Jackson's appearance remains identical, a lean man of medium height, with hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and a distinctive scar across his left jawline. Even accounting for the photographic limitations of the era, the consistency is biologically impossible. The 1901 photograph deserves special attention. It was taken at the Winston County Harvest Festival, an annual event that drew residents from throughout the region. Jackson appears at the edge of a group portrait, partially turned away, as if reluctant to be captured by the camera. Yet his profile is unmistakable, the same man who appears in images taken decades earlier, without the slightest indication of aging. What's most telling about this photograph is the reaction it provoked. Within days of its development and display at the general store in Blackridge Hollow, 3 men arrived from Birmingham. According to the storekeeper's grandson, whom I interviewed in 1997, these men purchased the original glass negative and all printed copies, offering far more than their value. They claimed to represent a historical society, but their credentials were vague, and their interest in this particular image was never explained. What happened to William Jackson that arrested his natural aging process? What terrible price did he pay for this unnatural preservation? And why did the most powerful families in Alabama mobilize to destroy all evidence of his existence after the events of 1903? The answers begin with Dr. Elias Mooreland, the forgotten pioneer of experimental medical techniques that would not become mainstream for another century. In 1847, Mooreland established a private research facility on his family estate outside Huntsville. The official records claim he treated tuberculosis patients. His private journals tell a different story. Mooreland was not merely a physician. He was a biological visionary whose work defied the medical understanding of his era. Born in 1805 to a wealthy plantation family, he studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania before continuing his education in Europe. In Paris, he worked alongside Claude Bernard, one of the founders of experimental medicine. In Edinburgh, he studied with James Young Simpson, the pioneer of anesthesiology. But it was during a 2-year expedition to South America that Mooreland encountered something that would transform his understanding of human biology. In the high-elevation cloud forests of Colombia, Mooreland documented fungal species previously unknown to science. His field journals, portions of which survive in the archives of the Natural Science Institute in Philadelphia, describe organisms with remarkable properties. The indigenous healers utilize a fungal preparation to treat grievous wounds, he wrote in 1841. I have witnessed injuries that would prove fatal elsewhere heal completely within days when treated with their poultice. The local tribe guards access to the source jealously, considering it sacred to their ancestors. Mooreland returned to Alabama with specimens preserved in alcohol and detailed notes on their preparation and application. For 6 years, he conducted private research at his family estate, experimenting first with animals and later, it appears, with human subjects. His earliest test subjects were slaves from his family's plantation, a grotesque exploitation typical of medical experimentation in the antebellum South. These initial experiments are documented only in coded entries in his private journal, but the implications are clear and horrifying. Subject 12 demonstrates remarkable recovery rate following severe tissue trauma, Mooreland wrote in 1846. Complete regeneration of damaged structures within 72 hours. However, subsequent cognitive deterioration suggests the compound affects cerebral tissue in ways I do not yet comprehend. Subject terminated after violent episode. By 1847, Mooreland had refined his techniques sufficiently to establish a formal research facility, ostensibly for tuberculosis treatment. He recruited desperate patients from throughout the region, promising revolutionary treatments for the deadly disease. Some of these patients genuinely suffered from tuberculosis. Others, I believe, were selected specifically for characteristics that Mooreland thought would make them responsive to his experimental compounds. Subject WJ continues to demonstrate remarkable tissue regeneration following the third administration of the serum. Mooreland wrote in October 1849, "The compound derived from the fungal specimen exhibits properties beyond my most ambitious hypotheses. The cellular preservation effect appears total and irreversible. I have created something terrible and magnificent." 3 months later, Mooreland's research facility burned to the ground. All patients and staff reportedly perished in the fire. The state medical board investigated the incident, then abruptly closed the case. The report was sealed by judicial order. Mooreland himself disappeared from public record. But what really happened in that fire? The official account, published in the Huntsville Advocate on January 17, 1850, described a tragic accident, an overturned oil lamp that ignited in the night while patients slept. Yet land records show that Mooreland's property was sold to a holding company 3 weeks before the fire. Bank transactions indicate he transferred substantial funds to financial institutions in New Orleans and London in the days preceding the disaster. And most tellingly, a letter from Mooreland to a medical colleague in Philadelphia, dated 1 week after the fire, contains this cryptic passage. "The unexpected results with subject WJ have compelled me to terminate the current phase of research. The ethical implications are too profound for me to continue under present circumstances. Yet the subject himself presents a continuing dilemma that I cannot in good conscience abandon. I have made arrangements for his care away from prying eyes. Perhaps in time, the scientific community will be prepared to confront what I have discovered. Until then, I go into voluntary exile with my burden of knowledge." But William Jackson did not perish in that fire. He emerged, transformed, his body altered at the cellular level by Mooreland's experimental treatments. He returned to his homestead in the remote hollows of Winston County, where he lived in increasing isolation as the decades passed without leaving a mark on his flesh. I believe Mooreland himself arranged Jackson's escape from the research facility before the fire, recognizing that his experimental subject had become something unprecedented in medical history. A human being whose cellular structure had been fundamentally altered, whose natural aging process had been arrested, whose body regenerated damage with unnatural speed. The doctor couldn't bring himself to destroy his creation, nor could he allow Jackson to become the subject of widespread scientific scrutiny, so he gave him the only gift possible under the circumstances: anonymity in isolation. Property records confirm that Jackson's land in Blackridge Hollow was purchased in 1837, more than a decade before Mooreland's experiments. But church records from the Winston County Baptist Association indicate that Jackson was absent from the community from 1848 to 1851, roughly the period when he would have been a patient at Mooreland's facility. When he returned, he was changed in ways that went beyond his physical appearance. The locals noticed, of course. You cannot exist unchanged for 50 years without drawing attention. They whispered about the man who never aged, who recovered from injuries that would kill ordinary men, who grew increasingly withdrawn as he watched generation after generation grow old and die while he remained frozen in time. Elizabeth Calhoun, who taught at the one-room schoolhouse in Blackridge Hollow from 1877 to 1889, kept a personal journal documenting life in the small community. Her entries about Jackson reveal how his condition was perceived by his neighbors. Mr. Jackson attended the school Christmas pageant this evening, remaining at the back of the room and departing before the social gathering afterward. The children find him frightening, though he has never been anything but polite in my presence. Mrs. Goulm. Tanner made a peculiar comment that has lingered in my thoughts. She said her grandmother had been sweet on Jackson when they were both young, before he went away and came back, touched by something not of this world. When I pointed out that this would make him extraordinarily old, she gave me such a strange look and said, "That's what we don't talk about, Miss Calhoun. That's the thing nobody mentions to his face." Isabella Thornfield's journal from 1887 describes an encounter with Jackson that left her deeply unsettled. Mr. Jackson called upon Father today regarding the property boundary dispute. I was struck by his appearance, for he looks precisely as he did when I was a child, 20 years hence. His manner was most peculiar. He spoke with the cadence and idioms of a bygone era, and seemed unfamiliar with common household items. When Mother mentioned my grandmother's passing, a strange expression crossed his face. "The terrible burden," he whispered, "is to remain while all others go into the ground." Other accounts suggest Jackson became increasingly reclusive as the 19th century progressed into the 20th. He stopped attending community gatherings entirely. He conducted necessary business through intermediaries when possible. He built his cabin deeper in the hollow after a fire destroyed his original homestead in 1879, positioning it near the entrance to a cave system that few locals knew existed. The cave would prove central to understanding Jackson's condition, but before we explore that connection, we must examine how his unnaturally preserved body began to demonstrate even more extraordinary properties as decades passed. By the 1890s, Jackson's condition had progressed beyond mere cellular preservation. Augustus Whitley, a physician who examined Jackson after a logging accident in 1892, documented the incident in a letter to a medical colleague. "I witnessed with my own eyes the complete regeneration of severed tissue. The subject's left hand had been nearly removed at the wrist by a saw blade. By the time I arrived, some 30 minutes after the injury, the bleeding had stopped entirely. Within 3 hours, new tissue had visibly formed across the wound. By morning, the hand had restored itself to such perfection that only a faint line remained where the devastating injury had been. I administered morphine not for pain, he claimed to feel none, but to calm his terrible agitation as he watched his own flesh knit together against all laws of nature." This account is particularly valuable because Dr. Whitley was not a local country physician, but a well-regarded surgeon who had studied at Johns Hopkins and practiced in Birmingham. He had traveled to Winston County to visit his ailing mother when he was called to attend to Jackson's injury. His scientific training made him a more credible observer than superstitious locals who might attribute Jackson's condition to supernatural causes. Whitley's subsequent correspondence reveals a growing obsession with Jackson's condition, along with increasingly panicked references to being watched by men who appear at my door with government credentials but will not identify their specific office or purpose. 6 weeks after his final letter about Jackson, Whitley was committed to Bryce Hospital for the mentally ill. His admission documents, signed by 3 prominent Alabama physicians, diagnosed him with delusional parasitosis and fantasies of miraculous healing. He died within a month. The official cause of Whitley's death was listed as acute septicemia following self-inflicted wounds. But a nurse who attended him during his final days told a different story. In 1943, Beatrice Langley, by then an elderly woman living in a Birmingham nursing home, gave an interview to a graduate student researching the history of mental health treatment in Alabama. The student's thesis was never completed. His academic career ended abruptly when his research notes were destroyed in what was officially ruled as a dormitory fire. But a transcript of the interview survived among Langley's personal effects, discovered after her death in 1946. The doctor wasn't insane when they brought him in, Langley insisted in the interview. He was terrified. He kept saying they were going to kill him for what he'd seen. He wouldn't say who they were, but he was certain they had infiltrated the hospital staff. The night he died, 2 men I'd never seen before or since were admitted to the secured ward without proper credentials. The next morning, Dr. Whitley was found dead in his room. His body was removed before any of the regular staff could examine it. The official cause was infection from self-harm, but I saw no evidence of such wounds during his previous examinations. But Whitley wasn't delusional. He had stumbled upon a biological anomaly that powerful interests were determined to keep secret. The question remains, why did Jackson's condition warrant such elaborate suppression? What greater secret was his unnatural longevity protecting? The answer lies in the geological uniqueness of Blackridge Hollow. In a remote gorge, inaccessible except through Jackson's property, there exists a cave system containing fungal species found nowhere else on Earth. Botanical surveys conducted in the region in 1922, after Jackson's property had been acquired by the Northeastern Alabama Mining Consortium, include coded references to specimens demonstrating extreme mutagenic properties and organic compounds requiring highest security protocols. These scientific observations, hidden within mundane geological reports, connect directly to Mooreland's earlier experiments. The fungi growing in those caves, in that specific mineral-rich environment, contained compounds that could fundamentally alter human cellular structure, arresting decay, accelerating healing, preventing aging. Jackson wasn't merely Mooreland's patient. He was living proof of the most profound medical discovery in human history. The peculiar geological formations of Blackridge Hollow created a unique environment for these extraordinary organisms. The hollow sits atop an unusual limestone formation, riddled with caves and underground streams. Mineral-rich water percolates through these caverns, creating the perfect conditions for the specialized fungi that Mooreland had first encountered in South America. Whether these organisms evolved independently in both locations or were somehow transplanted remains unclear. What is certain is that Jackson's property contained the only known North American source of these biologically transformative compounds. Jackson himself appears to have understood the connection between his condition and the caves on his property. As his isolation increased, he spent more time in the cave system. Local children, daring each other to venture near the witchman's house, reported seeing Jackson emerge from the cave mouth, covered in a strange, luminescent dust. After such excursions, neighbors noted, he would appear particularly vigorous, even by his unusual standards. Ezekiel Thompson, a local hunter who occasionally traded game for tools with Jackson, provided a rare first-hand account of the cave interior in a statement to a traveling folklorist in 1899. "I wouldn't have gone in there, except a wounded buck led me straight to it. The entrance looks like any other cave mouth until you get about 20 feet in. Then everything starts to glow, blue-green light coming from growths on the walls and ceiling. The air feels thick, like breathing through wet cotton. I found Jackson deep inside, just sitting there, staring at the glowing patches. He seemed angry at first, then resigned. Said I shouldn't stay long unless I wanted to change. Said he came there when the pain got bad. Didn't explain what pain. Said the cave was a blessing and a curse. I left quickly and never went back, though sometimes I dream about that light." Thompson's account is consistent with bioluminescent fungi, which often thrive in cave environments. But the thick air he describes suggests spores or other particulates suspended in the atmosphere, precisely the kind of exposure that might lead to the biological alterations Mooreland had deliberately induced under controlled conditions. If Jackson was regularly exposing himself to these organisms, his condition might have been continuously reinforced over decades. And certain powerful interests wanted exclusive control of that discovery. Throughout the 1890s, land acquisition records show systematic purchases of property surrounding Jackson's homestead. The buyers were shell companies, but trace the incorporation papers, and you'll find the same three names appearing as directors and financiers: Senator Hollis Green, industrialist Theodore Blackwood, and Judge James Wyatt Carson. Three men who controlled the political, economic, and legal power structures of northern Alabama. These men wanted the fungal specimens in those caves. They wanted Mooreland's research. And they wanted William Jackson, or more specifically, they wanted to understand what had happened to his body. But Jackson, increasingly unstable after decades of unnatural existence, refused all offers to sell his land or submit to examination. The instability of Jackson's mental state is a crucial aspect of this story that deserves careful consideration. Contemporary accounts suggest that while his body remained preserved in its late 30s condition, his mind was deteriorating in complex ways. He exhibited symptoms consistent with extreme temporal disorientation, the psychological effect of experiencing a lifespan far beyond normal human parameters. Dr. Joseph Kirkland, a physician who treated Jackson briefly for pneumonia in 1897, noted, "The patient demonstrates perfect recall of events from 50 to 60 years prior, but struggles to maintain awareness of recent occurrences. He repeatedly addressed me by the name of a doctor long deceased and expressed surprise at modern medical instruments that have been in common use for 20 years. Most disturbing was his casual reference to individuals known to have died decades earlier, as if they were still living. When gently informed of their passing, he exhibited momentary confusion followed by profound melancholy. This temporal disorientation appears to have worsened as the century turned. Multiple accounts from Blackridge Hollow residents describe Jackson wandering the forest at night, calling out names of people long dead. He began to dress in clothing styles that had been out of fashion for half a century. His speech patterns shifted between different eras, sometimes within the same conversation. These behaviors might have been dismissed as the eccentricities of a hermit in other circumstances, but they took on a more sinister significance when juxtaposed with his unchanging physical appearance. Several local accounts suggest Jackson became increasingly paranoid during the final years of the 19th century. He constructed elaborate systems of tripwires and alarms around his property. He boarded over windows and installed multiple reinforced locks on his doors. He began to carry an old army revolver whenever he left his cabin. These security measures suggest he was aware of growing interest in his condition, perhaps even specifically aware of the powerful men who were systematically acquiring the land surrounding his property. The financial records of Senator Green, industrialist Blackwood, and Judge Carson reveal a pattern of increasing investment in medical research during this same period. In 1897, they jointly established the Alabama Progressive Medicine Initiative, ostensibly a charitable foundation to advance public health. In reality, it served as a vehicle for private research into cellular regeneration. They recruited physicians from throughout the country, offering exceptional salaries for work conducted at a discreet facility outside Birmingham. The initiative's charter included unusually specific language about research into arresting cellular deterioration and exploration of human tissue regenerative capabilities. By 1900, they had assembled a team of specialists in emerging fields like histology and biochemistry. They had also established a private security force under the direction of former military officers, a curious requirement for a medical research foundation. Most tellingly, they had acquired all land surrounding Jackson's property, effectively isolating him from any contact with the outside world except through points they controlled. What they couldn't acquire through purchase, they obtained through legal manipulation. Judge Carson issued a series of rulings, restricting access to the road leading to Blackridge Hollow, citing obscure county ordinances. Senator Green secured federal classification of the surrounding forest as restricted watershed, preventing development or travel without special permits that his office controlled. Blackwood's company security forces began to patrol the perimeter, ostensibly protecting valuable timber resources, but effectively creating a cordon around Jackson's increasingly isolated homestead. Then came the winter of 1903, when 7 people died at Jackson's homestead in a single night. Then came the winter of 1903, when 7 people died at Jackson's homestead in a single night. The Birmingham Sentinel called it a killing spree by a deranged mountain man. "Madman slaughters innocent travelers," the headline screamed. The article described Jackson as a wild-eyed lunatic who invited passing strangers into his home, then butchered them with an axe before sheriff's deputies shot him dead. A convenient narrative, but one contradicted by the suppressed evidence. The newspaper account included several details that defy logical scrutiny. First, it claimed the victims were travelers seeking shelter from a winter storm, yet the hollow had been effectively sealed off from public access for years by that point. Second, it described Jackson as an elderly recluse, contradicting the appearance he had maintained for decades. Third, it stated that sheriff's deputies responded to sounds of screaming reported by nearby residents, but the nearest neighbors were miles away across rugged terrain, and all surrounding property was owned by the three powerful men who had been trying to acquire Jackson's land for years. Even more telling is what the newspaper account omitted entirely. No mention was made of the identities of the supposed victims. No explanation was given for why 7 strangers would happen to be traveling through a remote, restricted area in the middle of a February snowstorm. No details were provided about the subsequent investigation or the disposition of Jackson's property. The true record of that night exists in a single document, the field report of Deputy Marshal Clayton Reed, written hours after the incident and subsequently removed from county archives. I discovered a carbon copy hidden between the pages of Reed's personal Bible, preserved by his granddaughter, who understood its significance, but feared the consequences of making it public. When I first contacted Edith Palmer, née Reed, in 1992, she was reluctant to discuss her grandfather's service with the Winston County Sheriff's Department. Some things are better left buried, she told me during our initial phone conversation. Only after months of building trust did she reveal the document she had protected for decades. Granddaddy never talked about what happened that night, Palmer explained as she carefully removed the brittle carbon paper from between the tissue-thin pages of the family Bible. But he wanted someone to know the truth. He wrote in the margin here, see? The Lord knows what really happened. Maybe someday the people should know too. Reed's report tells a very different story. Upon arrival at the Jackson homestead at approximately 9:15 p.m., I observed 3 private carriages bearing the insignia of the Blackwood Manufacturing Company. 7 individuals were deceased within the main house. 4 wore physicians' attire with surgical implements on their persons. 2 were armed guards in private uniforms. The 7th was William Jackson himself, restrained to a table with leather straps, his abdomen surgically open from sternum to pelvis, with organs evidently removed and placed in specimen containers. Despite this catastrophic wound, Jackson's body exhibited signs of active tissue regeneration at the incision margins. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood was in attendance, alive but severely injured with defensive wounds. He repeated the phrase, "He wouldn't die," before expiring at the scene. Evidence indicates the surgical team was systematically dissecting Jackson while he remained conscious. The subsequent violence appears to have occurred when Jackson broke free from restraints during the procedure. The report continues with clinical precision, documenting the scene in methodical detail. The physicians had brought extensive equipment with them: surgical tools, preservation containers, microscopes, and a remarkable early version of a camera designed for microphotography. They had transformed Jackson's simple cabin into a temporary operating theater. Based on the systematic arrangement of specimens and notes, it is clear this was not a hasty or improvised operation. It had been meticulously planned. Most disturbing are Reed's descriptions of Jackson's body. Subject exhibited multiple surgical interventions in various stages of healing. Evidence of repeated tissue extraction visible across torso and limbs. Some incisions appeared to be healing with extraordinary rapidity, even as I conducted my examination. Despite catastrophic trauma that would immediately terminate life in an ordinary person, subject maintained signs of biological function for 27 minutes after my arrival, with visible movement of remaining internal organs and continued tissue regeneration at wound margins. Reed's report continues, describing how he was immediately ordered by Sheriff Harland to surrender all evidence to representatives from Judge Carson's office. By morning, the bodies had been removed, the homestead burned to the ground, and a completely fabricated account was provided to newspapers. Reed was transferred to a remote posting in southern Alabama the following week. What happened that night was not a killing spree. It was a sanctioned medical abduction that went catastrophically wrong. Jackson hadn't invited those men to his home. They had come to take by force what he wouldn't sell. They had come to dissect the secret of his immortality while he still lived. And somehow, despite injuries that would instantly kill any normal human, Jackson had broken free and taken revenge upon his tormentors. The subsequent cover-up was immediate and comprehensive. Judge Carson personally issued the orders to seal the area. Senator Greene arranged for federal agents to secure the perimeter under the pretext of a public health emergency. Blackwood's private security forces removed all evidence from the site. The official narrative of a hermit's murderous rampage was disseminated through newspapers owned by Blackwood's business associates. Within a week, every resident of Black Ridge Hollow had been approached with offers to purchase their property at generous prices. Those who hesitated received visits from county officials warning of imminent domain seizures for planned reservoir development. By month's end, the entire community had been evacuated. By year's end, it had been erased from maps and official records. But most disturbing of all was what happened to William Jackson himself. The official narrative said he died at the scene, his body destroyed in the subsequent fire. Death certificates were filed. The case was closed. The hollow was abandoned. For all official purposes, William Jackson and the atrocity committed against him ceased to exist. But a collection of documents from the Alabama Progressive Medicine Initiative tells a different story. A story far more horrifying than the violent death reported in the newspapers. Except William Jackson didn't die that night. How could he have survived such catastrophic injuries? The answer lies in the nature of his condition. Mooreland's treatments hadn't merely arrested Jackson's aging. They had fundamentally altered his relationship with mortality itself. His cells regenerated at an unprecedented rate. Injuries that would kill an ordinary human were, for him, merely temporary inconveniences. Even the massive trauma inflicted during the botched surgical abduction wasn't sufficient to end his existence. Sheriff's reports claim Jackson died at the scene, his body burned in the subsequent fire. Death certificates were filed, the case was closed. Except William Jackson didn't die that night. This point bears repeating because it represents the most profound horror of this entire case. A man who could not die was subjected to dissection while fully conscious. When he fought back against his tormentors, killing 6 of them in the process, he was not killed in retaliation as reported. Instead, he was captured, sedated, and transported to a facility where his living vivisection could continue under more controlled conditions. 3 weeks after the Black Ridge Hollow incident, a patient was admitted to the restricted ward of the Bryce Hospital under the name Patient 37. The admission was authorized by Judge Carson with no diagnostic information provided. The patient was held in isolation, with only specific approved physicians granted access. All documentation regarding Patient 37 was kept separate from the main hospital records. The restricted ward of Bryce Hospital deserves special attention in this narrative. Established in 1861 as the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane, Bryce was originally designed according to the progressive Kirkbride plan, which emphasized moral treatment and dignified surroundings for the mentally ill. The main hospital building, with its imposing Victorian architecture, housed hundreds of patients in what were, for the era, relatively humane conditions. But beneath this veneer of therapeutic intention existed a shadow facility. Subterranean chambers, originally designed as storage areas and mechanical spaces, were gradually converted into what hospital staff euphemistically called special treatment areas. By the 1890s, this restricted ward operated as a de facto private research facility under the control of a board dominated by political and industrial interests, including, not coincidentally, Senator Greene and associates of Theodore Blackwood. Hospital architectural plans from 1890 show extensive renovations to these underground spaces, including the installation of reinforced doors, specialized ventilation systems, and what are described as, quote, patient security measures that more closely resemble prison infrastructure than medical accommodations. Electrical systems were installed years before the rest of the hospital was wired, allowing for activities that required lighting but needed to remain hidden from public view. A nursing attendant named Mary Shelton kept a secret diary of her observations while assigned to the restricted ward. Her entries from March to June 1903 describe a patient with an unholy constitution who survived without food or water for weeks at a time, whose terrible wounds closed themselves before my eyes, and who spoke lucidly about events from the 1840s as if they had occurred recently. They harvest tissue from him daily, Shelton wrote. Dr. Lowell extracts blood, skin, and on 2 occasions, entire organs, which the patient regenerates within days. They administer doses of compounds that would kill an elephant, documenting his body's response. He endures in a twilight between life and death, neither state fully claiming him. Shelton's diary entries become increasingly disturbed as weeks pass. She describes horrific procedures conducted without anesthesia, justified by physicians. Claims that the patient, quote, does not experience pain as normal humans do. She documents conversations among the medical team that reveal their broader objectives. Dr. Lowell spoke with the senator today regarding progress. She wrote on April 29th. He explained they have successfully isolated the compound responsible for cellular regeneration, but cannot yet reproduce its effects in other subjects. The senator seemed displeased and reminded him that certain parties expect practical applications before the next election cycle. Dr. Lowell assured him that tissue grafts from the primary subject have shown promising results in the secondary subjects, though the effect remains temporary. The senator asked if they might simply use continuous harvesting from the primary subject as a sustainable solution. The physician seemed disturbed by this suggestion, but did not reject it. The most disturbing entries detail the increasing callousness with which the medical team regarded their subject. Initially, they maintained the pretense of legitimate research, carefully documenting procedures and results. But as months passed, this scientific veneer eroded. They began referring to Jackson not as a patient, but as the specimen, or simply 37. They conducted procedures that had no apparent research purpose beyond satisfying macabre curiosity about the limits of his regenerative capabilities. Mary Shelton disappeared in July 1903. Hospital records state she resigned her position and relocated to Chicago. No further record of her existence appears in any public document. Patient 37 remained at Bryce Hospital until 1917, when all references to the restricted ward abruptly cease. That same year, a new research division was established at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, specializing in tissue regeneration and cellular preservation. The division operated with War Department funding despite having no official government contracts. The transfer of Jackson from Bryce Hospital to the Blackwood Research Facility coincided with America's entry into World War I, a convenient cover for moving sensitive research under the umbrella of national security. With the country mobilized for war, unusual activities could be more easily concealed as military necessities. The War Department's involvement provided an additional layer of secrecy as their operations were exempt from normal oversight and disclosure requirements. Hospital records from this period are suspiciously incomplete. The official explanation for the closure of the restricted ward cites reallocation of resources for the war effort. No disposition is recorded for patient 37 or any other individuals who might have been held there. The facility itself was ostensibly converted to storage space, though architectural records indicate that much of the specialized equipment was removed rather than repurposed. What evidence exists of the transfer comes primarily from financial records rather than medical documentation. The accounting ledgers of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals show a substantial one-time payment to Bryce Hospital in February 1917, categorized vaguely as acquisition of research assets. That same month, the company's internal records note the establishment of a new high-security laboratory at its Birmingham facility, with specialized containment equipment and significantly increased security personnel. Most tellingly, a coded telegram from Theodore Blackwood to Senator Greene, dated March 3, 1917, reads, "Package delivered intact. Stop. Research continues. Under new arrangements, stop. All parties satisfied. With term stop." The clinical detachment of this message, referring to a living human being as a package, speaks volumes about how completely Jackson had been dehumanized by those exploiting his condition. The connections grow clearer and more disturbing with each document I uncover. The fungal compounds from Jackson's property, combined with Mooreland's experimental techniques and the ongoing biological material harvested from Jackson's immortal body, became the foundation for classified medical research that continues to this day. The Blackwood Research Facility's earliest work focused on immediate military applications, developing treatments for battlefield wounds that could return soldiers to combat more quickly. Their public records claim modest success with improved antiseptic compounds and surgical techniques, but internal documents suggest far more dramatic results achieved through direct tissue grafting, using material harvested from Jackson to temporarily transfer his regenerative capabilities to wounded soldiers. A 1918 laboratory report describes an experimental procedure in which cellular material from subject 37 inches was implanted into a soldier with a shattered femur that would normally require amputation. Complete bone regeneration observed within 14 days, the report states. Subject mobile without assistance after 30 days. Effect temporary, with degradation of implanted material noted after approximately 60 days, necessitating repeated application for sustained results. This pattern, dramatic but temporary results requiring ongoing harvesting from Jackson, established the fundamental ethical abomination at the heart of the research. Rather than focusing primarily on synthesizing or replicating the compounds that had transformed Jackson, the researchers found it more expedient to simply use him as a renewable source of biological material. His immortal body became, in effect, a living mine, from which they could extract an endless supply of regenerative tissue. Cellular preservation, tissue regeneration, biological immortality. Not science fiction, but science fact, achieved over a century ago, and kept hidden from the public while being developed by privileged interests. Consider the lifespans of the three men who orchestrated the 1903 incident. Senator Greene, Judge Carson, and Theodore Blackwood all lived well beyond 100 years, their longevity attributed to, quote, good genes and clean living in their glowing obituaries. All maintained robust physical capabilities until shortly before their deaths. All kept themselves removed from public view in their final decades. But most tellingly, the founding document of the Blackwood-Greene-Carson Foundation, established in 1954 to fund medical research of a specialized nature, includes a peculiar provision requiring all research subjects to be referenced only by numerical designations, with the specific stipulation that the designation 37 is permanently retired and shall never be assigned to any subject, specimen, or project under the Foundation's purview. This single clause, buried in legal boilerplate, provides a direct lineage from the Jackson incident to modern research conducted under the Foundation's auspices. It suggests not merely continuity of knowledge, but a specific acknowledgement of Jackson's centrality to their work. Retiring his designation reads almost like a twisted form of respect, acknowledging that without Subject 37, none of their subsequent achievements would have been possible. The Foundation's early work remained tightly focused on longevity research and regenerative medicine, with findings circulated only among a small network of affiliated scientists and physicians. But as decades passed, commercialized versions of their discoveries began to appear in mainstream medicine, always missing the key components that would make them truly revolutionary, always presenting as incremental improvements rather than the paradigm shifts they actually represented. Consider the career of Dr. Walter Harriman, who served as the Foundation's research director from 1962 to 1989. His public bibliography lists 37 publications in prestigious medical journals, each presenting modest advances in wound healing or tissue preservation. Yet his private laboratory notebooks, which I obtained from his former research assistant who had preserved them after Harriman's death, tell a far more dramatic story. The dilute serum derived from subject 37 tissue continues to demonstrate remarkable properties when applied to cellular cultures. Harriman wrote in 1967, "Complete arrest of deterioration observed in all sample groups. Replication continues at normal rates, but senescence markers remain absent even after 100-plus division cycles. The eternal cell line appears achievable, though full organism application remains problematic due to supply limitations and integration issues." Another entry from 1973 is even more explicit. Concentrated extract from legacy source successfully transferred regenerative properties to primate subject. Complete recovery from otherwise fatal trauma observed within 72 hours. Effect duration approximately 4 months before degradation of transferred cells. Calculating optimal harvesting schedule from LS to maximize yield while maintaining viability of the source material. The clinical detachment of these notes cannot obscure their horrific implications. Decades after his abduction, William Jackson, now referred to as Subject 37 Inches or Legacy Source, remained a living specimen, his immortal tissues still being harvested to produce treatments available only to the privileged few with access to the Foundation's resources. I believe William Jackson, or what remained of him, was held in a private research facility for decades, his immortal biology providing the basis for experimental treatments administered to the wealthy and powerful. I believe the secret of cellular immortality was achieved in those Alabama hollows over a century ago. And I believe that entities still actively suppress this knowledge, protecting both the terrible secrets of the past and their ongoing exploitation of this forbidden science. What ultimately became of William Jackson himself? The trail goes cold after 1917. Perhaps even an immortal body eventually breaks down under the strain of decades of surgical harvesting. Perhaps Jackson finally achieved the death that had been denied him for so long. Or perhaps he exists still, in some hidden facility, the unwilling atom of a medical advancement that could transform humanity if it were ever made public. The last definitive evidence of Jackson's continued existence comes from laboratory records dated 1963, which reference original source material still being utilized in baseline comparisons for experimental treatments. The clinical language deliberately obscures whether this source material constitutes an intact living being or merely preserved tissue samples. But given the Foundation's history and the unique properties of Jackson's condition, I believe he remained at least partially alive and conscious, well into the latter half of the 20th century. A medical prisoner whose sufferings enabled the extended lives and restored health of the privileged few, granted access to treatments derived from his body. Consider the implications of this timeline. If Jackson was born around 1813, as census records suggest, and remained biologically active until at least 1963, he would have existed in some form for 150 years, most of that time spent as an unwilling research subject. The longevity that might have been a gift under different circumstances became instead a sentence to unending torment. Unable to die, unable to age, unable to escape. Jackson endured a fate that transcends ordinary concepts of cruelty. But the historical record doesn't end with Jackson himself. The research derived from his unwilling participation spawned an entire shadow medical industry, one that operates in parallel to conventional healthcare, but remains accessible only to those with the right connections and sufficient resources. 3 times during my investigation, my research materials have disappeared from locked offices. Twice I've discovered listening devices in my home. 7 interview subjects canceled our appointments after receiving visits from government health officials they could not subsequently identify. I persisted in my investigation not out of mere journalistic ambition, but because William Jackson deserves to have his story told. The monstrous crime committed against him, ongoing for over half a century, must be exposed. But now, by sharing this information with you, I've made you part of this unfolding history. You possess knowledge that certain interests have killed to protect. The burden of truth is now partially yours. What will you do with it? As for me, I've arranged for copies of my complete research files to be held by trusted individuals, to be released should anything unexpected happen to me, because the most terrifying aspect of this story isn't just what happened to William Jackson. It's the demonstration of how completely the powerful can erase history when it threatens their interests, how thoroughly they can remove all traces of events and people they wish to hide. The fungal compounds in Black Ridge Hollow offered a dark bargain, cellular immortality in exchange for humanity. William Jackson didn't choose his fate. It was thrust upon him by Mooreland's experiments. But those who came after, who exploited Jackson's living body, who orchestrated decades of cover-ups and disappearances, they made their choice with full awareness, and I believe they walk among us still, their unnaturally preserved bodies hiding centuries of secrets, their aged eyes watching from behind youthful facades. Because once you understand what happened to William Jackson, you begin to recognize the patterns continuing into the present. Look at the pharmaceutical breakthroughs of the past decade in cellular regeneration. Examine the board members of the companies behind these innovations, their family names, their connections to Alabama industrial fortunes. Consider the classified military research into enhanced healing factors for special operations personnel. All of it traces back to those remote hollows and the immortal man who became a living laboratory. The winter of 1903 was merely the midpoint of William Jackson's story, not its conclusion. His body, unable to age, unable to die, became the unwilling source of medical miracles. Every modern wound-healing treatment, every cellular preservation technique, every anti-aging breakthrough contains echoes of the atrocity committed in that remote cabin. We owe our medical advances to an immortal man who suffered endlessly in secret laboratories. In the restricted archives of the Blackwood Foundation, there exists a photograph from 1939, labeled simply Subject Origin Reference. It shows a man strapped to a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment from that era. Though the image quality is poor, the subject's face is clearly visible, hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and a distinctive scar across the left jawline. 90 years after Mooreland's initial experiments, William Jackson remained imprisoned in an ageless body that could not die, that regenerated through every violation, that preserved his awareness through unending torment. The ethical implications are staggering. If immortality was achieved, why was this knowledge suppressed? The answer lies in power and control. Cellular preservation threatened too many power structures, religious, economic, political. Controlled access to such technology becomes the ultimate form of power. A secret immortality, available only to the select few who control the research, the compounds, the processed materials derived from Jackson's unwilling body. I've traced the supply chains of certain restricted access medical treatments provided to high-level government officials and billionaires with terminal diagnoses. Treatments not listed in any public medical literature. Treatments that sometimes result in miraculous recoveries. All connect back to research facilities funded through shell corporations linked to the Blackwood-Greene-Carson Foundation. The implications stretch beyond a single immortal man in the Alabama hills. They suggest a century-long conspiracy to control the most profound medical discovery in human history, to ensure it remains available only to those deemed worthy by virtue of wealth or power or strategic value. A conspiracy that began with the brutal exploitation of William Jackson continues today in sterile laboratories and private medical facilities. Public records indicate the original Jackson property in Black Ridge Hollow remains under the ownership of the Northeastern Alabama Mining Consortium, though no active mining has occurred there since 1917. The entire 340-acre parcel is designated as an environmental hazard zone, restricted from public access and regularly patrolled by private security contractors. Satellite imagery shows multiple structures within the restricted area, including what appears to be a modern research facility built into the hillside near the original cave system. Are they still harvesting the fungal compounds that granted Jackson his cursed immortality? Are there other unwilling subjects held there, modern iterations of Patient 37? The evidence suggests the research never stopped. It simply became more sophisticated in both its methods and its concealment. The question that haunts me most is not what happened to William Jackson. The record, fragmentary though it may be, makes that horrifyingly clear. What truly disturbs me is how many others have shared his fate in the centuries since. How many unnamed subjects have lived and lived again in secret facilities, their bodies exploited for the cellular secrets they contain. Because if William Jackson's immortality was scientifically achieved, then it can be scientifically reproduced. And those with the knowledge and resources to do so have had over 100 years to perfect the process, to overcome the limitations, to create more efficient methods of harvesting what they need. Consider the Longevity Research Initiative, established in 1972 with Blackwood Foundation funding. Its stated purpose was exploring the genetic factors contributing to exceptional human lifespan. But internal documents reveal a different focus: identifying individuals with natural genetic mutations affecting cellular regeneration. Individuals whose biological anomalies might replicate aspects of what happened to William Jackson. How many people disappeared into that research program, listed officially as participating in long-term residential studies? The initiative operated for 27 years before dissolving and transferring all assets to a new entity, Cellular Horizons, which continues to operate from a secure facility in the mountains of northern Alabama, less than 30 miles from the original Blackridge Hollow site. The geographical connection is no coincidence. Whatever continues to grow in those caves, whatever unique combination of minerals and fungal organisms created the compound that transformed Jackson, remains the source material for ongoing research. They keep returning to those hollows, to that biological wellspring, because whatever they've managed to synthesize from Jackson's tissue remains an imperfect copy of what naturally occurs in that isolated ecosystem. In William Jackson, they found their unwilling atom, the first of a new human lineage that does not age, does not die, but pays for that immortality with unending suffering. What began as a medical breakthrough became a living nightmare for the subject. And those responsible made a choice. Rather than destroy their creation or release their discovery to the world, they would exploit Jackson's immortal body for their own gain. That exploitation continues in different forms, in different facilities, with different subjects. The fungal compounds from Blackridge Hollow remain the foundation, but a century of research has refined the process. Modern subjects might not even understand what's happening to them. The treatment presented as an experimental cancer therapy, a revolutionary surgical technique, a classified military enhancement. The methods have evolved. The fundamental atrocity remains constant. I've witnessed the effects firsthand. 3 years ago, I interviewed a former security contractor who had worked at the Cellular Horizons facility. He described patients in isolated rooms, their bodies in various states of what appeared to be accelerated healing from massive trauma. They'd cut pieces off, he told me, his hands shaking as he knocked back another shot of whiskey, and watched them grow back, over and over. Sometimes the subjects screamed for days without stopping. Sometimes they just stared, like their minds had gone somewhere else while their bodies kept going. The man disappeared 4 days after our conversation. His apartment showed signs of hasty packing, according to the police report. His bank accounts remained untouched. His car was found at Birmingham International Airport, but no record exists of him boarding any flight. This is the pattern that repeats throughout my investigation. Witnesses who vanish, evidence that disappears, official channels that suddenly close. The machinery of suppression remains as effective today as it was in 1903, when they erased the truth about William Jackson from public record and replaced it with a convenient fiction. But the truth persists in fragments, in documents preserved by those who recognize their significance, in testimony from those who glimpsed behind the veil before being silenced. And in tracing these fragments, a larger picture emerges, not just of William Jackson's fate, but of the invisible structure built around exploiting the discovery his body represented. The Blackwood-Greene-Carson Foundation, the Northeastern Alabama Mining Consortium, the Longevity Research Initiative, Cellular Horizons. Different names for the same underlying enterprise, the controlled development and exploitation of biological immortality. The question remains, why maintain such secrecy? If they've mastered cellular regeneration and biological preservation, why not release these medical miracles to the world? The answer is as old as power itself. Scarcity creates value. Universal immortality would destroy economic systems, religious frameworks, political structures. But immortality as a closely guarded privilege, that becomes the ultimate form of power, the literal embodiment of the eternal ruling class. I believe the descendants of those original 3 men, Senator Greene, Judge Carson, and Theodore Blackwood, along with others who have been granted access to the treatments in exchange for protecting the secret, constitute a hidden elite who have extended their lives far beyond normal human limits. They move through the world in bodies that do not reveal their true age, wielding influence across generations, maintaining a continuity of purpose that ordinary humans, with their limited lifespans, cannot match. Look at the current CEO of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, Alexander Blackwood, supposedly the great-grandson of Theodore Blackwood, but who bears such a striking resemblance to his ancestor that they could be twins. Examine the career of federal Judge Marion Carson, whose judicial philosophies and writing style remain eerily consistent with those of her great-grandfather, Judge James Wyatt Carson. Consider Senator Elizabeth Greene, whose private correspondence sometimes references events from the 1940s with the intimacy of personal experience, despite being allegedly born in 1975. These aren't descendants. They are the originals. Their aging processes, arrested by treatments derived from William Jackson's immortal cells, their identities periodically refreshed through staged deaths and fictional inheritances. They are the beneficiaries of the atrocity that began in those Alabama hollows, an atrocity that continues to this day. The most recently dated document I've discovered relating directly to William Jackson himself comes from 1978. A laboratory requisition form from a Blackwood Foundation facility requesting additional tissue samples from original source material, OSM-37, along with notations about accelerating degradation and increasing cellular instability. After more than a century of forced regeneration, even Jackson's immortal body was beginning to fail. Did he finally achieve death after 130 years of unnatural life? Or did they find ways to sustain what remained of him, preserving the original source material that proved more valuable than any subsequent test subject? The records go silent after that 1978 requisition, but the research clearly continued. The Blackwood Foundation's confidential expenditure reports show consistent annual budgets for historical source maintenance, a line item that continues to appear in documents as recent as last year. I believe William Jackson exists still, not as a conscious being, but as preserved tissue, as immortal cells in laboratory freezers, as the genetic blueprint from which all subsequent treatments are derived. His body may have finally broken down under the century-long strain of forced regeneration, but parts of him continue to fuel the research. The final violation, reducing a man not just to a test subject, but to components, to raw material. The historical William Jackson, the human being who lived in those remote hollows, has been erased so thoroughly that reconstructing his actual life requires archaeological precision. Before Mooreland's experiments transformed him, he was a farmer and part-time blacksmith, born around 1813 in Western Virginia, who migrated to the Alabama territories in the 1830s. Census records indicate he married twice, first to Mary Calloway, who died in childbirth in 1841, and later to Rebecca Haynes in 1867. No children survived from either marriage. Neighbors described him as reserved but skilled, particularly known for crafting distinctive iron hinges that can still be found on some historic structures in Winston County. He fought briefly in the Seminole Wars but returned home with a jaw injury, likely the source of his distinctive scar, before being deployed to the main conflict. Otherwise, his life left few ripples in the historical record until Mooreland's experiments rendered him immortal. This ordinary man, a skilled craftsman who knew personal tragedy, who lived through the territorial period and the Civil War, who worked the land with his hands, became the unwilling progenitor of a secret medical revolution. His life was stolen from him twice, first by Mooreland's experiments that trapped him in an unaging body, and then by those who exploited that condition for their own gain. William Jackson deserves to be remembered not as the murderous hermit of the false newspaper account, but as the longest-suffering medical test subject in human history. A man who could not die, whose body was repeatedly violated, whose very cells continue to be used without consent long after his consciousness has presumably ended. And the perpetrators of these atrocities, both the historical figures and their contemporary counterparts, deserve to be exposed for creating and maintaining a system of medical apartheid, where the most profound breakthrough in human history remains restricted to a select few, while the rest of humanity ages and dies in ignorance. The fungal compounds in Black Ridge Hollow offered immortality at a terrible price. William Jackson paid that price unwillingly. Those who came after made their choice with full knowledge of the consequences, not just for themselves, but for the subjects they exploited and the world they deliberately kept in the dark. As you absorb this information, consider the implications. Consider why powerful interests have worked so diligently to keep this history hidden. Consider what other medical miracles might exist, developed in secret laboratories and available only to those with the right connections or sufficient wealth. And most importantly, consider what responsibility knowledge brings. You now know what they never wanted revealed. The question becomes, what will you do with this forbidden truth? Will you dismiss it as conspiracy, as fiction, as the ramblings of a paranoid mind? Or will you begin to see the patterns yourself, in unexplained disappearances, in miraculous medical recoveries among the elite, in pharmaceutical breakthroughs that emerge seemingly from nowhere? the truth about William Jackson represents more than historical injustice. It reveals the existence of a medical apartheid that continues to this day, a system where immortality itself has become the ultimate privilege of power. This is the secret they killed to protect. This is the truth they erased from history. And now, you know. The weight of this knowledge is now partially yours. Use it wisely, because they're watching. They're always watching. And they've had more than a century to perfect the art of silencing those who know too much. William Jackson's immortal cells continue their endless division in secret laboratories, sustaining the privileged few while the truth remains buried. But truth, like those immortal cells, has its own persistent power. It divides and spreads. It regenerates after injury. It cannot be permanently destroyed. And now it lives in you.